Hello everyone. In today's lesson, we're going to learn about the development section of the sonata form. By now, you should be familiar with this sonata form diagram. Repeat signs dividing the sonata form into two major parts. First part being the exposition, second part to contain the development and the recapitulation. We have also discussed the exposition section more in detail. We talked about how the exposition is considered a journey through two key areas. The primary key area, also called the primary theme or the first theme. The secondary key area, secondary theme, second theme group. Those are all possible names for this. And these two key areas being linked by what we call a transition. And at the end, a closing section to reconfirm the new key area of the secondary key area. So again, a journey through two key areas, primary, secondary, a transition to connect those two, and a closing to reconfirm the secondary key area. When you're analyzing the exposition of a sonata form, a good way to figure out the two key area is to see what the piece begins in, what key it begins in, and what key the exposition ends in right before the repeat sign. That will be a very easy way, a very simple way to quickly identify what those two keys are. Now that we've reviewed the exposition section of the sonata form, we will now continue to discuss the next section, the development. To quote the authors of our textbook, begin quote, "Unlike the exposition or the recapitulation, the musical events of the development are more flexibly patterned." So let me write down a few keywords. The musical events of the development are more flexibly patterned. So what does that mean? If you remember what we talked about the exposition section, we said the exposition is a journey through two key areas, the primary and the secondary. And this is going to be true no matter which composer's sonata we're looking at, whether it's Mozart's sonata, Beethoven's sonata, Haydn's sonata, Brahms' sonata, Schumann's sonata. The journey through two key areas. The two key areas are the ones that we call primary and secondary in the exposition. This is almost always going to be true in every sonata form movement. However, in the development section, it can be very different from one sonata to another. Different in that the number of keys being tonicized. It could, in one sonata, we could in the development, it's possible that we see only one or two keys really being tonicized in the development before the recapitulation returns. In another sonata, it's possible that we see 10 different keys being referenced, whether it's briefly tonicized or it's a more extended key area. It's possible that we see more of just a few keys. So the number of keys being tonicized can be very different in the development section from one sonata to another. Also, the thematic material that's used in the development section can also be very different from one sonata to another. For example, in one sonata, it's possible that we see only the thematic material from the primary that's being brought back in the development, and in another sonata, it's possible that we see the material from primary as well as the material from secondary, Also material from the transition and closing. Everything is being brought back in the development section. And so that's another aspect that can be very different from one sonata to another. Also, the developmental techniques used. Developmental techniques used in the development of a sonata can also be very different from one sonata to another. So what does that mean, developmental techniques here? So we've actually studied this before, things like sequence, repetition, transposition, and fragmentation. All these kind of things, this is what we call developmental techniques. So in one sonata, maybe we saw repetition, maybe we saw fragmentation of earlier material and sequence of that. And in another sonata, maybe we don't see any of that. We really just saw the entire primary being brought back, but in a different key. That's possible as well. So all these items, the number of keys being tonicized, the thematic material being used, and the developmental techniques being used in the development section can be quite different from one sonata to another. Although the development section of a sonata form is considered to be much more flexibly patterned, it still follows a particular dramatic trajectory. So it can be summarized this way. Let's take a look at this graph here. The development section of a sonata form usually features these three areas. Stability. What that means is we will see tonal stability, a key area, a key being tonicized, a key area being featured, and the music actually stays there for a rather extended period of time, as well as instability. Instability means we're going to see various keys being tonicized, only very briefly, not no key. We never really stay in one key for an extended period of time. So tonal instability. And at the same time, the thematic material that we might hear will include new material or just fragments of earlier material, so all kinds of possibility. At the end of the exposition, we're going to hear what we call the dominant preparation, preparing for the return of the home tonic key in the recapitulation. And we call this dominant preparation the retransition. Okay, so in this graph, I included a little more details about what I said earlier about the development section, featuring stability, instability, and finally the retransition, preparing for the recapitulation, and more details about each one. So stability, we might hear new themes, we might hear reprise of previously introduced themes in the primary and secondary key area in the exposition, and we might also hear new keys that were not featured in the exposition section. However, the music actually stays in the key for a little longer, which is why we call this area stability. And secondly, instability. So under instability, a few key points here: thematic fragmentation. So this is as opposed to the longer phrases like 4+4 kind of parallel period. Instead of that kind of symmetrical phrase structure, maybe just a motive and it gets sequenced, and a fragment of the previous melody going through sequence, going through repetition, going through modulation or change of key. So lots of thematic development here. Motivic variation, sequences, tonicization, and more importantly, brief tonicization, because it doesn't really stay in that key for long period of time, and as well as cadences in new keys. So all these are features of instability. Last but not least, the last part of the development section is what we call the retransition. And retransition, oftentimes what we see is some kind of dominant pedal point or some kind of dominant prolongation, some harmonic motion that features dominant being extended. Because as we learned before, if we hear the dominant for an extended period of time, you are expecting the return of the tonic. So the retransition here, which usually lands on half cadence, which provides the best preparation for the recapitulation.